Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bro Doc Talk. We have an excellent physician here for you all today, so we're really excited to hear her story. My name is Henry Lewis III. I'm a residency program coordinator and former pre-health advisor.
And hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Omar Young. I am a maternal fetal medicine subspecialist. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Tera Howard. I will have her introduce herself, and then we'll have a great chat. Dr. Howard?
Hi, everybody. My name is Tera Howard, and I just want to start off by saying thank you, Henry and Omar, for inviting me to this space to kind of share my story with your audience. So I am an obstetrician gynecologist. I work as an academic physician. So my kind of practice is in an academic environment where I get the opportunity to teach residents, teach medical students, essentially train the next generation of OBGYNs, which is really, really fun for me. As far as my story, I was raised in a military town called Sumter, South Carolina. It is kind of situated in the Midlands of South Carolina, about an hour and a half from Charleston, about 45 minutes from the coast, in case you're familiar at all with South Carolina. I went to Wake Forest, a small liberal arts college for undergraduate. And there I majored in kinesiology and minored in religion. I chose kinesiology because it had, the opportunity to take human anatomy, and I knew that was something that I was super interested in, and I really thrived in that major, and I don't regret it at all. So if you're interested in medicine and you're in that space, then you totally don't have to major in biology or chemistry. You can still become a doctor and major in something different and learn about different things in different ways. From there, I went to Vanderbilt University for medical school. And at Vanderbilt, I obtained my medical doctorate, but then I also pursued a master's in public health. So from Vanderbilt, I obtained both an MD and a master's degree and completed that coursework in 5 years. There are various programs out there that have combination MD plus degrees and programs. So if you're interested in that kind of trajectory, I'd encourage your audience to pursue that and make sure that the medical school that they're interested in has these kind of flexible combination opportunities. From there, I went to Northwestern University in Chicago for residency. It was one of the best choices that I've ever made. It was a fantastic training program that kind of exposed me to a lot of different ways of practicing medicine, a lot of different communities and populations, because it was kind of a combination program where we took care of patients that were privately insured and then also took care of patients that had no insurance or were underinsured. So it kind of made for a very well-rounded obstetrics and gynecology education. So I wouldn't trade that for the world. After Northwestern, I took my first academic job at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I was on faculty there. I always knew that I wanted to do academics, always, because educating learners is one of the things that I think fills my tank up, and it actually really fulfills the mission, right? The reason that I feel like I'm here on this earth. And so I never really entertained the idea of private practice. I always wanted to do academics. And my time at UAB was my first kind of academic job. And then in 2020, I was there for about 5 years. And then in 2020, I was recruited to where I am now, the University of Texas at Austin Dell Medical School. And I was recruited here to kind of do a dual role. So I'm not just an academic OBGYN, but I also have administrative responsibilities in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the breakdown of my job, 60% of the time I'm clinical, where I'm teaching residents, I'm, covering the labor floor, I'm doing gynecologic surgery, I'm in clinic, and then the other 40% of my time is spent administratively. And that's kind of split in two roles. So I work as the Director of Diversity for Graduate Medical Education at UT Austin Del Med, where I get the opportunity to coordinate the recruitment and diversity efforts across the whole institution for our 47 plus GME programs. And then the other part of my administrative job is that I serve as the Associate Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for my own department, so for the Department of Women's Health. I love academics because it gives me the opportunity to not only practice medicine and pour into the next generation of doctors, like I told you, but it also gives me the opportunity and the flexibility to pursue my own individual passions. And diversity, equity, inclusion is one of those passions. I'll say that, the reason that DEI is important to me, for short, diversity, equity, inclusion, is because, I formulated that I wanted to be a doctor very early in my life. So I remember very specifically, I was in elementary school and we were kind of doing library time. And I picked up a book about the medulla oblongata, or the human brain. And I opened the page to the medulla oblongata and I thought, this is the coolest word I've ever seen. And this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I want to do something with that, right? So I actually entered medical school thinking I was going to be a pediatric neurosurgeon, which is kind of interesting. But I bring that up to say, I had nobody in my life, nobody in my sphere of influence, nobody that I could touch who was a doctor who had ever pursued anything at all about medicine. So for so many years, right, I was pursuing this passion without any role models, without anybody who I could look to say, I can do it because this person who looks like me has done it. And so because of that kind of feeling of isolation, or the trajectory of isolation, you can't help but say, I got to change the system to make it better. And out of that, that lived experience that I had kind of birthed in me the passion to make it easier for the next people coming behind me, particularly diversity, equity, inclusion in academic medicine.
That's amazing. Just for our listeners, we're recording this episode during Black Maternal Health Awareness Week. And Dr. Howard, I think both you and I would say that it's a very important week, not just for our specialty, but for our country, given what is happening with maternal mortality, particularly amongst reproductive people who are African American. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on your role as a Black OBGYN in the setting of this current maternal mortality crisis.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that, I was pleasantly, I don't want to say surprised, but pleasantly surprised, I guess, that, all the media attention started to happen around Black maternal mortality and morbidity, severe maternal morbidity, in the recent years. It was things that we were seeing, right, in the clinical spaces, but we didn't have, the data around it, or the media frenzy or attention around it. So happy that over the last several years, people are starting to pay attention to the clinical disparities that we observed, that Omar and I have observed for years, right? I do think that we all have a part to play in reducing these gaps, and it's important to own your part, right? So if you're in the clinical workspace and you're in front of a Black patient and you have, the knowledge that this person, just by virtue of racism, not their race, but racism, has a 3 to 4, time chance or increased odds of having a terrible maternal outcome, then you as the provider have to use that personal, your sphere of influence and that personal experience with the patient to help close that gap for her or reduce her own risk. And that's your part, right? So some of my part is trying to increase the pipeline. I don't even necessarily want to use that word, but increase the access that Black folks have to other Black folks in the clinical space. We know that that matters. We know that it matters. It matters in terms of trust between the patient and the system. We know that that matters based on perspective, right? So if I come from a shared lived experience as you, then I might look at you and understand you a little bit differently or better than someone else without that shared experience. So my part and my role is not only kind of delivering that intimate one-on-one care, but it's also building infrastructure to help increase the diversity among the workforce, because we're the people that are serving these Black patients.
Exactly. So, and you bring up a really good point, like the origins of the maternal mortality crisis and healthcare disparities and inequities is not race. Race is like social construct that, has been created to divide us and to prop up those that would want to deem themselves superior for whatever reasons. What we see right now is the effects of strategic, structural, institutional, as well as internalized racism.
Mhm.
And I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think my presence in medicine is to disrupt those systems. And in doing so, you may be seeing yourself as disruptive.
Mm.
So I wonder, how have you felt being a Black woman in medicine, knowing that you have these passions for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and knowing what's going on in the community?
That's a weighty question, Omar. I'll just tell you that. Because there's the work, right? The work that brought me here, the work that keeps me here, which is to make sure that our patients, regardless of race, experience the equal opportunity to health, right? That is what health equity is. So there's the work. But to your point, we are performing this work in a historically and current racist system, right? And we define racism by, it's very easy to define it, right? When there are inequitable outcomes, right, across races, then by definition, the system's racist, right? When we have, a disparity in terms of the workforce, right, where there are less Black folks in medicine comparative to the population, we know then, right, by definition, that the process into medicine then is a racist process. And so when when I'm kind of operating in this system, I try to kind of highlight, what brought me here, which is trying to deliver health equity, trying to create a system for my patients or deliver care for my patients that's equal and appropriate. But I do, as a Black woman, feel the weight of racism, right? And I have experienced racism personally in my trajectory getting here, and that does impact you. It does impact you personally. But one of the things that I think of, or at least that kind of helps me deal with that, is understanding that I'm a resilient person and I can't necessarily look to work to fill my tank up. I have to look to other places, right? I look to my faith to fill my tank up. I look to my family to fill my tank up, and to help shoulder me against what we know, right, is a racist environment. So yes, I have experienced racism. Yes, it's hard. And the work is still important enough for me to continue to engage in it always.
Dr. Howard, as we've just discussed, there are a lot of threats and a lot of, negative experiences that Black physicians have to face in training and practice. And getting through that sometimes requires some very good mentorship. Did you have any really good mentors, in your training or in practice that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I really did. I had some good mentors, just kind of along the way, sometimes unexpected mentors. And I'll tell you that there are, sometimes you're looking for a certain type of mentor because you think that might be the only person who can provide you what you need. But I personally have found mentorship in unexpected places. I found it in those places where I've looked, but I've also found it in unexpected places. And so being open to, I'll say whatever God brings you, right? I think is an important posture to have. So yes, I've had great mentors in medical school, excuse me. I've had great mentors in residency. I've had mentors that have persisted since that time until now. I even find really good mentorship in peer mentorship, right? So people who are just maybe slightly ahead of me, who I can glean from and really kind of take hold and learn from their own experience. I mean, I'm glad you asked the question about mentorship, Henry, because I think it is absolutely critical. And it's one of the things that I work hard to develop for the learners who are coming behind me, develop infrastructure such that mentorship is not as hard to find as maybe it had been for me.
what's one of the biggest lessons you learned from one of your mentors?
Mm, I think it's hard to say a specific lesson, but I will say the ones that have been the most effective for me have been available. Have been available for me, you know. So not everybody has the time to mentor, and even if you see somebody that's like, you know, hey, I want to latch onto that person, but if they don't have the bandwidth to take, you know, to take you on, quote unquote, or so to speak, then they could be the best person in the world, but if they don't have the time to devote to you, then they're not the right person for you. So I've kind of learned that. I've also learned how important it is to not see mentors like a big M, like a be all end all person, right? So I can gain mentorship from Omar in a specific area. He doesn't have to be my big M mentor from which I have to glean my whole life's plan. Right? You can mentor me in a particular area. We can have a relationship in which you pour into me, I receive. That mentorship relationship can be, it can have a time limit and an expiration, and that's okay. So these are kind of the lessons that I've learned about mentorship. Yes, you can find it in unexpected places. No, you shouldn't expect a mentor to be everything to you. Yes, your mentor should be available if they're going to be a good mentor to you. And yes, you can have kind of specific areas in which someone can mentor you. And when that relationship ends, it doesn't mean that there was something wrong with it. It means that it's just kind of time to move on.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the relationship between the mentor and a mentee should be very explicit, transactional, that not me as the mentee, I should be able to garner what I want from you, and that should be said up front.
Mm-hmm.
You as the mentor should be able to provide that to me.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not able to provide that to me, that's okay, but you shouldn't be my mentor.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And we always talk about mentorship when it comes to underrepresented trainees as well as underrepresented faculty. But I think we also forget to talk about sponsorship.
Mm-hmm.
Can you, for our listeners, can you tell our listeners what sponsorship means to you and how do you use it in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, I think understanding sponsorship in its comparison or difference from mentorship is important. So, mentorship, like you kind of described, you know, is a relationship between two people around a certain topic. It's very relational. Whereas sponsorship is a little bit more transactional, right? So I need this from this person who typically has a position of authority or more access and power than I may have in a particular area. So sponsors become important because sponsors exist in a space that in a level of access in the space that the mentee or benefit or the student or learner or whatever, that person doesn't exist, right? And so you need sponsors to open doors and create access, you know, for the mentee, for example. Sponsors are, you know, obligated to speak well of you in rooms where you're not present. Sponsors should be secure in their own positionality, right? To be able to spread the power, right, to the mentee, so that the mentee can, you know, experience the benefit of it. So it's very different. Mentorship is relational, and sponsorship's like, no, I need this, and the only way that I can get this is if my sponsor opens the door for me to get it. You know, there's a opportunity I'd like to recommend this person for, you know. There is a position that I'd like to open the door. Oh, you've asked me to be, you know, X, Y, and Z on this board. Instead of me, I would like for you to consider my mentee instead. That kind of thing. The important thing I think about sponsorship relationships, in order for them to work well, there's a level of trust that has to exist, right? So if I use my name and my access and my power and my privilege in whatever area to sponsor a mentee, then that mentee now has the obligation to fulfill the relationship, right? Or fulfill the requirement, because otherwise then my name's on the line and my name's mud, right? So it's very much kind of dependent on the sponsor's reputation in that space too.
Right. And I think due to challenges that underrepresented trainees and faculty face, we don't have that necessarily that access to sponsorship. So I think all of our presence in medicine is super important, such that for our trainees, as well as co-faculty, we are able to provide that sponsorship and mentorship, which is incredibly important.
Absolutely.
So
I think there's data, I'm sorry, Omar, that suggests that, although overall, URMs and people from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to have a little bit less mentorship compared to their, majority counterparts, they even more so have less sponsorship, right? There's more access to mentors than there is access to sponsors, to your point. And there's data that suggests that in the academic environment. So yeah, we need more sponsors. And I think it's critical to success to have both mentorship and sponsorship.
So how do we keep underrepresented folks in academics, right? Because I have lots of colleagues who tell their stories about leaving academics, right? How do we keep people like ourselves in academics such that when, a fourth-year medical student considering going to OB comes to us and wants to be us, how do we say, yes, you should do what I do, as opposed to saying, run for the hills?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm so glad you asked this question, Omar, because I have very strong feelings about it, actually. I think that the kinds of motivators or things that bring you and me into medicine, it's very much a passion-driven thing, right? Like, so we see, our communities suffering and we say, hey, like, I want to meet that need. I'm going to go into medicine, right? So we kind of have a very deep and strong commitment to our communities. Oftentimes, and the data bears it out, people of URM backgrounds tend to go back to the places and serve the communities from which they came, or communities that are similar, right? So we kind of have passion driven into academia, medicine and academia. But unfortunately, academics traditionally hasn't rewarded, right, our commitment to that type of passion. So, for example, I discussed how important it was for me to, increase the pathway for people behind me who look like me into medicine. An academic institution doesn't reward that with academic promotion, right? They don't care if I have 50 URM mentees. That takes time, that takes effort, right? But I'm still in this academic environment. And so when I'm doing all these things, these passion-driven things, yes, caring for my community, yes, giving back, yes, mentoring, and I don't have a reward on the other end, then of course that's going to lead to burnout. And I'm going to say, after a while, deuces, this is enough. So I think in order to retain folks, we have to work as academics has to work to build institutional infrastructure, right, to combat this manifestation of racism, because I think that's exactly what it is, right? When Black and brown folks are doing stuff that's not rewarded by the institution, we're experiencing these minority tax, this incredible minority tax, and the institution says, okay, go kick rocks, like that's on you. So to remedy that, I think the institution has to build infrastructure to start rewarding, right, the things that we do that give us passion. Start rewarding in formalized ways, mentorship. Start giving, credit. I mean, Omar, you and I know about the program that I developed. That's how you and I met. Push the institutions to start saying, hey, why don't we give academic credit towards promotion for all the mentorship that you're doing, right? That's how we combat this burnout and reduce the minority tax and work towards retaining Black and brown folks into this academic space. I think it's completely time out for us to rely solely on people's altruism and goodwill. We have to start rewarding people for the efforts that they're making.
Right. I always say I'm happy to mentor students or fellows or faculty, or give a lecture, a seminar, or whatever, but my time is not free, right? So if I'm giving of myself to other people, then I have nothing left, right? And so I agree with you 100% that, academic centers need to rethink exactly what their priorities are. Specifically, if you're saying diversity, equity, and inclusion are part of your mission or your tenets, are you actually executing that with your faculty who you want to be part of that mission?
Tangibly. Because lip service, I think we're at the point now where lip service is just not enough. And actually, if you say things without having structural support for those things, that makes people even more disenfranchised and distrusting, and even more likely to say, you know what, forget this, because your lips are saying it's something completely different than what the structure is supporting.
Dr. Howard, what are the top threats to Black men and women training in medicine?
Ooh, that's a good one. Henry, that's a good one. So I think in my role as Director of Diversity for Graduate Medical Education, I actually I have the privilege of serving the institution in this way, but I also have the burden, right, of receiving all the stuff, hearing all the stories, observing all the inequities in the clinical learning environment, and I would say that there are some common refrains that come up right in my space. Yes, it's and the data bears this out. Black and brown folks have a harder time getting into residency programs. They do, even when you adjust for step scores and things like that, right? So the gateway into entry is harder for us in the GME space. But once we get in, I would say one common thing is inequity in assessment, right? So when a person comes in and they're a new intern and they're trying to keep their head above water and learn how to be a doctor, actually learn how to be a doctor, there's a learning curve, right? There's a learning curve that every last person experiences in the learning environment. I would say that you would imagine that naturally on that learning curve, there'll be mistakes and stumbles and all this kind of stuff, which is a part of learning. I will tell you that Black and brown folks, when they stumble, in the normal ways that every learner stumbles, they tend to have more negative consequences attached to that. People are assessing them more harshly, right? They're attributing error to decreased intelligence, right? They're attributing certain things to, lack of professionalism that they wouldn't otherwise attribute to somebody who was of a lighter hue, right? So they get labeled, right? And once somebody's labeled, it's really hard to get out from under that label. And so I'm kind of using the broad term of inequity in assessment because people aren't treated equally. And unfortunately, there's kind of a snowball effect when that happens, right? So that leads to more, remediation plans for Black and brown folks. That leads to higher attrition rates, higher dismissal rates. And we see that that's true across the country in the clinical learning environments. Number one, inequity in assessment.
So what do we do about that? You have all the answers. You have all the answers.
I have all the answers. I wish, right? So I think a measured approach to it would be to, number one, just start kind of looking in your own environment to see if this phenomena is happening. I think there's a lot of kind of talk, but you know how James Baldwin basically said, hey, we can't change anything that we don't acknowledge, right? And so looking in your own microenvironment and say, hey, let me actually look at our structured learning plans or our remediation plans and see if there's a disparity by demographics, including race. If there is, right, if there's not, fantastic. But if there is, and I have a suspicion that a lot of times there will be because these are national trends in your own environment, then ask yourself why. Start to get granular. It takes time and it takes effort, but the first step to that is actually looking in the mirror.
Yeah, I would agree with 100%. You think of my own training as well as experiences as being a faculty member, so it doesn't stop even when you get that certificate of residency completion. And so I'm 100% convinced that if I was not present in certain positions or clinical spaces that my Black and Brown trainees would have different outcomes based on evaluations, or, people love to use the word like professionalism, particularly with Black and Brown people, as I think of it as just coded language, right? So would you go to someone who was white, who did the same thing, but then has lesser quote unquote consequences? That interests me. Or like, if we have trainees who are literally just existing or voicing their opinions, they're seen as the classic code words are argumentative,
Aggressive,
abrasive, caustic, condescending, whatever you want to use with that. And I think it's important for faculty to be cognizant of these things that you were talking about and just call that out right then and there. Otherwise, things aren't going to change. And so that really hits home for me.
Absolutely.
Any other threats that you would perceive for our trainees?
Well, I think something happens to people when they are in a clinical environment and they experience the things that we've just discussed, right? There's something that happens to your confidence if you're told that you're this or you're told that you're that. When you're looking at other people to the left or the right behaving the same way you're behaving, or quote unquote worse, and they're not being told that. So there's I think the word imposter syndrome is now so overused, and so we use it all the time. Everybody have an imposter syndrome. But the phenomenon that I'm describing is if somebody tells you you're enough times you're dumb or you're unprofessional or whatever, how much of that do you start internalizing and start, and in some way behaving that way, right? And so it's hard, right? It's hard to tease some of this stuff out. And we know what the root is. The root is racism. But so the second threat, in addition to the inequity in assessment, is how that actually impacts the learner and then how they're able to show up in the workspace. I have an example in one of the institutions where I was. There was a resident who essentially the word on the street, the labeling, oh, this person, is not performing the way that this person should be performing, and this person's fund of knowledge isn't good. This person's not a leader. All the things, right? All this kind of ridiculous stuff. I'm like, you've gotten to this far. You're in residency. You are not dumb. Those things are mutually exclusive, right? Like that's impossible. But then that person's confidence began to be shaken, right? And then, I even observed in certain circumstances where that person was behaving as somebody who had been abused in that way, right? So that would be my second idea about a problem. What happens when you experience this kind of stuff? What does that do to your performance?
This conversation has been so good. And I hope like all of our listeners appreciate it. For anyone that is interested in going into medicine or specifically OBGYN, is there any advice that you would give our listeners?
I don't know. The first thing that I thought about as you were asking that question is you can do it. You can do it. There's nothing wrong with you. You don't have any deficits. You're not broken, so you don't need to be fixed, right? You can do it and you can pursue this. And even if you don't have any kind of role models or people that you are in your immediate orbit that you can look to, know that there are other people out there who have pursued this and have pursued it successfully. So open your mouth and try to get connected with people. Don't try to work and do all this on your own. Omar, you and I have kind of progressed, right? And probably have had certain kind of challenges in certain kind of spaces, right? And the goal is to say, I went through it, so you don't have to, right? So as the person who's pursuing it, you got to open your mouth, try to get connected with people who've done it before, and know that you are enough, right? You are enough and you can do it.
Dr. Howard, just before we close, kind of along with this advice, you said one thing earlier that really got me interested in asking you this question. But as you mentioned, a lot of pre-meds think that they need to major in biology or chemistry or something more traditional, and you majored in kinesiology. Can you tell the listeners, I guess, how that major helped you in your decision making and going to medicine, how that helped you in medicine as well, in medical school?
Yeah, so where I went to school, there was like a pre-med track.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you fulfilled the requirements of the pre-med track, you took the biology and chemistry and biochemistry and all that stuff, then really you could major in other things as long as you fulfilled the pre-med requirement. So what was wonderful about my major, so it was called health and exercise science where I was, but it's also, termed kinesiology at other places. I liked it because it gave me a really excellent foundation about the human body, right? So as physicians, our subject matter is the human body. It's not, and yes, the human body is made up of cells and all this kind of stuff. But as a unit, it's the human body, and health and exercise science or kinesiology teaches you a lot about how the human body functions, which is why you get early exposure to anatomy. I actually ended up being an anatomy TA in undergrad, and so that when I got to medical school and completed anatomy, it was like, oh, this isn't hard. Like, I got this. I've already done this. I've been here before. I've seen this stuff before. We also had classes like human movement and nutrition and all the things that really kind of discuss how the human body works. And so that's one of the reasons why I thought it was an excellent complement to what I wanted to do.
I love that. And I know oftentimes, those subjects are not taught as much in medical school. So for you having that background, you're able to help your peers and especially your patients. So thank you very much. Well, you heard it from the doctor herself, Dr. Tera Howard. Thank you so much for being a guest with us. And for the listeners, stay tuned for a new episode. Bye-bye.
Thanks.